What if the sky above us is not as familiar as we pretend it is? Most nights, the heavens feel orderly. Planets keep their paths. Stars hold their distance. Even the machines we have launched into orbit seem, from the ground, to belong to a world of charts and equations, where every object has a name, a purpose, and a record. We like to believe that near Earth, at least, mystery has given way to management, that the age of unknown things has passed. And yet, every so often, something unsettles that confidence. A radar signal appears where no launch was recorded. A dark object drifts through a photograph and resists easy explanation. A piece of metal, painted by human hands decades ago, seems to return from nowhere, like a message delayed by time itself. Around our planet, thousands of objects circle in silence. Most are cataloged, some are observed. A few remain suspended in a strange borderland between fact and doubt, between scientific record and unfinished story. This is not a tale about invasion or prophecy. It is something quieter and perhaps more unsettling than that. It is a story about how easily human certainty frays at the edges, about the artifacts we leave behind, the secrets nations keep, and the simple truth that even in an age of surveillance, not everything above us is fully understood. The deeper we look into orbit, the more it begins to resemble a mirror. We see ingenuity there, but also forgetfulness, ambition, but also silence. Every object circling Earth carries two histories, the one we can document and the one we still have to imagine. So before we ask what these wandering shapes might be, there is a more human question waiting beneath them. How much of our own world have we mistaken for something known, simply because it was easier than admitting we did not yet understand it? It began, as many enduring mysteries do, with a signal that should have belonged to no one. In February 1960, high above a divided world, radar operators detected an object moving through polar orbit. That alone was unusual. At the time, most satellites traveled on paths that reflected the logic of their launches, and a polar trajectory suggested a capability that neither Washington nor Moscow was eager to admit. The Cold War was still young, but already crowded with shadows. Every unknown shape in the sky carried the weight of strategy, fear, and imagination. The object was described in headlines with a phrase both simple and irresistible: the dark object. No public explanation arrived with enough authority to quiet the speculation. It seemed to appear out of nowhere, silent and distant, a small piece of darkness moving through the very theater where superpowers measured one another's reach. In an age when secrecy was routine, uncertainty became fertile ground. Was it an undisclosed Soviet satellite? A fragment of forgotten hardware? Or merely a misunderstanding amplified by the anxiety of its time? Seen from our century, the episode feels almost intimate, not because the object was close, but because the reaction to it was so recognizably human. Faced with incomplete evidence, people did what they have always done. They filled the silence with story. Scientists looked for mechanism. Governments guarded information. The public leaned toward wonder because wonder is often what remains when facts arrive slowly. There is something haunting about that early moment in the space age. Humanity had just begun to place its tools beyond the atmosphere, and already orbit was becoming a place where knowledge could outrun certainty. We were learning not only how to launch machines, but how to live with ambiguity above our heads. Perhaps that is the first lesson of objects like these. The unknown does not always announce a grand revelation. Sometimes it simply reminds us how quickly the sky can become mysterious again. What if the strangest things in orbit are not the objects we cannot identify, but the ones we eventually realize came from us? In '91, astronomers studying the sky noticed something unusual, a faint object moving in a path that suggested it might be temporarily caught by Earth's gravity. For a brief moment, imagination surged ahead of evidence. Here, perhaps, was a small, natural companion, a second moon too dim to see with the naked eye, a forgotten traveler circling close to home. The idea was irresistible. Even now, it carries a kind of old-world romance, as if the night sky had been keeping a quiet secret. But the truth, when it came, was less mythical and more revealing. The object was widely understood to be the upper stage of a Saturn V rocket, most likely a remnant from the Apollo era. Not a new celestial body, but a leftover instrument of human ambition. A machine built to carry astronauts toward the moon had not entirely left the story. Decades later, it drifted back into attention, transformed by distance and time into something almost unrecognizable. What looked at first glance like a discovery in nature turned out to be a relic of history. There is a peculiar beauty in that reversal. We often imagine the artifacts of exploration as fixed to museums, photographs, and dates in textbooks. But some of them remain aloft, still moving, still crossing the darkness long after the applause has faded. In orbit, our past does not always rest. Sometimes it returns like an echo, and that may be why such sightings feel so unsettling. They expose a tension we rarely name. We search the sky hoping to find what is not ours, only to discover traces of our own unfinished presence. The boundary between alien and familiar becomes less certain, less dramatic, and perhaps more meaningful. Because in the end, what haunts the space around Earth may not be evidence of strangers. It may be the lingering shape of our own ambitions, still circling, still asking what becomes of the things we create after we stop looking at them. It started with a glint too deliberate to ignore. In the long history of watching the sky, light has always been our first storyteller. A brief flash can suggest distance, shape, intention. It can turn a fragment of metal into a puzzle. That is part of what made the object, later nicknamed the Black Knight, so enduring in the public imagination. It was not merely that something appeared in orbit under uncertain circumstances. It was that over time, photographs, radio claims, and scattered observations began to gather around it like layers of frost, each one adding shape to a mystery no one could quite hold. The name itself carried more force than the evidence. Black Knight sounded ancient, watchful, almost ceremonial, as though the darkness above Earth had chosen an emblem. In reality, the story was assembled from different moments, different technologies, and different eras of speculation. A thermal blanket lost during a space shuttle mission could become, in the right photograph, a silhouette of impossible design. Anomalous radio echoes could be woven into tales of hidden satellites and forgotten origins. The human mind is skilled at this kind of stitching. We make coherence from fragments because fragments are hard to live with, yet dismissing the legend entirely misses something important. The Black Knight story endured not because people were foolish, but because it touched a deeper unease. By the late 20th century, orbit was crowded with objects most people would never see and few could explain in detail. Space had become both familiar and inaccessible. We had filled it with instruments, but not with understanding that felt personal. Into that distance, myth flowed easily. Maybe that is why certain orbital stories survive even after the facts are clarified. They are not really about proving the existence of something otherworldly. They are about the emotional experience of looking upward and sensing that our knowledge remains incomplete. And perhaps every age creates its own constellations of uncertainty, names for the places where evidence ends and imagination quietly takes over. What if the most revealing objects above Earth are the ones that were never meant to be seen for long? During the Cold War, space was not only a frontier of science, it was a high balcony for surveillance, a place where nations extended their vision while concealing their methods. Some satellites were announced with pride, others moved in quiet service, carrying cameras, sensors, and intentions that remained hidden behind official silence. For observers on the ground, that secrecy created a peculiar condition. The sky was becoming crowded, but not necessarily more transparent. Among the objects that stirred curiosity were those believed to belong to classified military programs. Their existence was often inferred before it was acknowledged. Amateurs, trackers, astronomers, and patient watchers sometimes noticed patterns that did not fit public records. A satellite would appear in orbit without ceremony. Its trajectory would suggest purpose, but not identity. It was there, plainly real, and yet wrapped in absence. In that gap between observation and confirmation, mystery took root. There is something profoundly modern in this kind of unknown. It is not ancient myth or cosmic folklore. It is bureaucracy lifted into orbit. It is the knowledge that some of what circles above us was designed precisely to remain unnamed. That truth changes the emotional texture of the night sky. The heavens no longer belong only to wonder or science. They also carry the residue of strategy, suspicion, and human rivalry. And still, even these secret machines become something else with time. Programs end, documents are declassified. Hardware once treated as untouchable history becomes another chapter in the story of how fear and ingenuity shaped the 20th century. What was once hidden turns ordinary, then historical, then strangely poignant. Because every secret object eventually enters the same silence as everything else in orbit. It drifts, decays, or is replaced. Its mission fades, but its presence lingers for a while in the record of human ambition. Perhaps that is the deeper tension above Earth. We send our instruments into the sky to gather knowledge, yet some of them return to us first as reminders of how carefully human beings ration the truth. It started with a photograph, the kind that seems ordinary until someone asks the wrong question. In '98, during the STS-88 mission, astronauts were assembling the early framework of the International Space Station when a striking image was captured against the blackness of orbit. It appeared to show an angular object suspended above Earth, dark and intricate, almost sculptural in its outline. To some viewers, it looked engineered in a way that felt unfamiliar. The image traveled quickly not through laboratories alone, but through the wider culture of speculation, where a single frame can outlive pages of explanation. What the camera preserved was almost certainly far less exotic and, in its own way, more revealing. A thermal blanket lost during the mission, drifting freely after slipping away from the shuttle's work. Detached from context, the object became something else entirely. Its folds looked rigid, its motion seemed purposeful. Seen against the silence of space, a loose fragment of equipment took on the gravity of an unanswered question. There is a lesson in that transformation. Space alters scale and meaning. In orbit, a blanket can resemble a machine. A shard of hardware can seem monumental. Without atmosphere, without familiar reference points, even human debris becomes abstract, almost mythic. The eye searches for patterns. The mind supplies intention. We are not easily satisfied by the idea that something strange is simply accidental. And yet the truth here is not disappointing. It may be more intimate than any fantasy. The image reminds us that exploration is never neat. History is not made only of triumphal launches and polished achievements. It is also made of objects dropped, tools misplaced, fragments set loose by the imperfect hands of human beings working in extraordinary conditions. Perhaps that is why such pictures stay with us. They show how thin the line can be between artifact and legend. In the vacuum above Earth, even our smallest mistakes can acquire the silhouette of mystery, asking whether wonder begins not in the unknown itself, but in the stories we tell, when certainty drifts out of reach. What if orbit is less a library of answers than an attic of unfinished intentions? By the time the modern space age matured, Earth was no longer surrounded by a handful of heroic machines. It was encircled by leftovers, booster stages, broken panels, paint flecks, abandoned satellites, lost tools, and fragments too small to see, but large enough to matter all, joined the silent traffic overhead. Most of them were not mysterious, and their names existed in ledgers, mission logs, and defense archives. And yet, taken together, they created something stranger than any single anomaly. A man-made environment so vast that even its creators could not fully hold it in mind. This is where mystery changes shape. It no longer arrives only as an unknown object glimpsed on radar. It emerges from accumulation. A faint reflection crosses a telescope image. An outdated catalog disagrees with a fresh observation. One object breaks apart, and the sky inherits 100 new uncertainties. In such a crowded realm, ambiguity is not an exception. It becomes the atmosphere of the story itself. There is a melancholy to this orbital clutter. Every fragment once belonged to a plan. It was manufactured, tested, launched with purpose. Engineers drew it on paper. Workers assembled it under bright lights. Someone believed it would help expand knowledge, strengthen security, or carry human beings closer to a dream. Then time passed, missions ended, priorities shifted. What remained continued circling, no longer useful, not yet gone. And so the region around Earth begins to resemble memory, not memory as a neat archive, but memory as people actually live it, layered, incomplete, full of objects whose meanings have changed. Some pieces remain vivid. Others drift at the edge of recognition. A few return unexpectedly and make us feel for a moment that the past is still moving. Perhaps that is why the idea of unexplained things in orbit touches such a deep nerve. It is not only about what we do not know, It is also about what we once knew clearly and then allowed to become distant, fragmentary, and strange. It began with watchers who were never supposed to matter so much. Long before space surveillance became a polished network of official tracking systems, there were amateurs with patience, notebooks, and telescopes pointed into the dark. They stood in backyards, on rooftops, in cold fields beyond city lights, following faint motions across the sky with a devotion that was part science, part listening. These observers did not control launches or write policy, but they noticed things. They compared timings, traced paths, and sometimes recognized patterns before governments chose to explain them. In that quiet labor, a different kind of knowledge emerged. Not secret knowledge exactly, but citizen knowledge. A map of orbit built from persistence rather than authority. Some of the objects they tracked were later identified as classified payloads or mission remnants. Others remain ambiguous for longer, sustained by the gap between what could be seen and what could be officially said. The result was an unusual partnership between precision and uncertainty. People with modest instruments were helping reveal the outline of a realm that powerful institutions still kept partially veiled. There is something deeply human about this. We often imagine discovery as the work of great agencies and named experts, yet history is filled with careful outsiders who keep watch at the edges. Their gift is not always explanation. Sometimes it is simply refusal. Refusal to look away, to accept blank space on the map, and to treat silence as an answer. And orbit, perhaps more than any other human-made domain, rewards that kind of attention. It is too large, too active, too layered with military, scientific, and historical residue to be understood from a single vantage point. The sky above Earth is not only a field of objects, it is a field of perspectives. Maybe that is why the story of unexplained things in orbit is also a story about who gets to witness history. Not just those who build the machines, but those who stay awake long enough to see them pass, and who understand that sometimes the first act of knowledge is simply to keep looking up. What if some objects become mysterious not because they hide from us, but because time removes the language we once used to describe them? As decades passed, more and more artifacts from the early space age remained aloft, like fading punctuation marks from a sentence the world had stopped reading closely. Experimental payloads, abandoned rocket stages, test hardware from forgotten programs, and fragments from missions once treated as urgent now drifted through a future their makers never really imagined. Records survived, but not always in forms easy to recover. Archives were scattered, secrecy blurred memory, engineers retired, nations changed. What remained in orbit was real, but the story attached to it sometimes thinned into rumor. This is how uncertainty matures. At first, an unexplained object feels immediate, almost electric. Later, it becomes something quieter, a historical residue, difficult to identify, not because it is impossible to understand, but because context has eroded. The object is still there, crossing the darkness with mathematical obedience, while the human world below has misplaced the thread that once made it legible. There is a sadness in that, but also a strange dignity. These remnants are not simply debris. They are evidence that human striving outlasts human attention. A test article launched in secrecy, a piece of mission hardware detached by accident, a classified satellite whose purpose was once fiercely protected, all of them eventually enter the same wider silence. Once they were urgent, now they are almost anonymous. And perhaps that is what makes them feel so haunting. They remind us that history is never only what is preserved in museums or textbooks. Some of it continues moving above us, unseen in daylight, unnamed by most of the people living beneath it. We think of the past as settled. Orbit suggests otherwise. Maybe the sky keeps these objects not as answers, but as questions. Not about alien worlds or hidden powers, but about how quickly human meaning can fade, even while the things we built continue faithfully on their way. It started to change when the unknown became measurable. For much of the 20th century, unexplained objects in orbit lived in a twilight between observation and interpretation. They were glimpsed in radar returns, caught in photographs, discussed in fragments, and enlarged by the distance between what institutions knew and what the public could confirm. But over time, the tools improved. Tracking networks grew more precise. Amateur observers became more sophisticated. Digital archives expanded. The sky did not grow simpler, but it became more readable. And yet precision did not erase mystery. It refined it. Today, many of the objects that once inspired extravagant theories can be traced to rocket bodies, mission debris, thermal coverings, or classified systems later acknowledged by history. That should be the end of the story. But it is not, because every explanation also reveals something larger. How often human beings mistake incomplete context for impossibility. The unidentified object is not always evidence of something extraordinary. Sometimes it is evidence of a gap between presence and understanding. There is humility in that realization. It asks us to treat uncertainty with care rather than appetite, to resist the urge to turn every anomaly into a revelation, but also to resist the opposite temptation, the easy dismissal that treats wonder as embarrassment. The more honest path is narrower. It allows that some questions deserve patience, that evidence takes time, and that the world can be both explainable and deeply mysterious at once. This may be the quiet maturity of the space age. We no longer stand at the threshold of orbit, imagining it as pure frontier. We know it now as a layered realm of science, secrecy, memory, and material consequence. We have learned enough to decode many of its shadows, but not enough to strip them of meaning. Because perhaps the most important shift is this: the unknown no longer feels like an enemy of knowledge. It feels like its companion, reminding us that understanding is not a possession. It is a process, one careful observation at a time. What if the real mystery was never the object itself, but the hunger it awakened in us? Every era chooses its symbols for the limits of understanding. In earlier centuries, it was the edge of the map, the vanished city, the uncharted sea. In the modern age, one of those symbols became the dark object in orbit, a shape moving above the world just beyond ordinary reach. We projected onto it what we feared, what we hoped, and what we could not yet explain. In that sense, these orbital mysteries were never only technical questions, they were emotional ones. Why do certain stories endure even after clearer explanations arrive? Perhaps because facts resolve mechanism, but not always meaning. To learn that a strange form in a photograph was a lost thermal blanket, or that an unidentified body in orbit was likely old mission hardware, does not erase the feeling those images created. The feeling remains because it belongs to something older than spaceflight itself. The human experience of confronting the unknown and sensing for a moment that reality may be wider than our habits allow. There is no shame in that response. Wonder is not the enemy of reason. It is often the beginning of reason, the first spark that makes us pay attention. The challenge is learning how to carry wonder without surrendering judgment, how to let mystery enlarge our perception without allowing it to harden into fantasy. That balance is delicate. Civilizations have always struggled with it, and maybe this is why the objects above Earth continue to matter. Not because they prove hidden worlds, but because they reveal the architecture of the human mind. We are creatures who search for pattern, who tell stories across silence, who cannot easily accept that a thing may be both ordinary in origin and extraordinary in feeling. So the deeper question may not be what moved through orbit unseen. It may be why, whenever something does, we so quickly recognize ourselves in the shape of its shadow. It begins, perhaps, with silence. Not the peaceful silence we imagine from the ground, but the immense, indifferent quiet of orbit, where objects move without announcing themselves and history leaves no sound behind. Up there, a piece of hardware and a relic of ambition can share the same path. A classified satellite, a broken fragment, an instrument once touched by human hands. All of them cross the dark with equal restraint. Space does not explain what it carries. It only preserves it for a while. This is where mystery deepens into responsibility, because the region around Earth is no longer empty enough for our uncertainty to remain romantic. It is busy, consequential, fragile. Every object, identified or not, belongs to a growing story about how humanity inhabits the space just beyond its atmosphere. The unknown is no longer only a philosophical condition. It is also a practical one. To misunderstand what moves above us is to misunderstand the environment we have made. And yet the emotional force of these orbital enigmas remains. Even in an age of tracking, systems, and catalogs, there is still something haunting about the thought that not everything has been neatly named, The traces of forgotten missions and hidden purposes continue circling overhead. The feeling persists because it touches more than curiosity. It touches stewardship. We are no longer only explorers looking upward. We are custodians of a sky we have changed. That may be the hardest transition for any civilization. Realizing that wonder does not disappear when knowledge grows. It becomes more demanding. To know more is to inherit more. More consequences, more memory, more obligation to distinguish between myth and evidence without losing the humility that made us look in the first place. So when we speak of strange objects above Earth, we are also speaking of a threshold in human maturity. Can we remain capable of awe while accepting responsibility for what awe has helped us build? Can we look into orbit not as children staring into a mystery, but as adults willing to care for one? What if, after all our measurements and explanations, the sky still remains a place where human certainty softens at the edges? By now, many of the once strange objects orbiting Earth have been interpreted with reasonable confidence. Some were remnants of lunar missions. Some were military hardware wrapped in secrecy until history caught up. Some were simple pieces of lost equipment, transformed by distance into symbols of something larger. The record, where it exists, has clarified much. And still, clarification does not empty these stories of meaning. If anything, it restores their true scale. Because the deeper drama was never about proving that something impossible hovered above us. It was about living through an era in which humanity extended itself into space faster than it could fully narrate what it had done. We built, launched, classified, misplaced, tracked, forgot, and rediscovered. Orbit became a place not only of exploration, but of delayed understanding. In that sense, every mysterious object was also a footnote to modern life. Evidence that progress often outruns reflection. There is something almost tender in that realization. We tend to imagine knowledge as a clean ascent, each question replaced by an answer, each answer settled into order. But human knowledge is rarely so graceful. It loops back, it loses labels, it mistakes its own artifacts for strangers. It discovers, again and again, that the world it has made can become unfamiliar when viewed from a new angle. And perhaps that is why these stories continue to resonate. They allow us to feel both smaller and more connected. Smaller because the sky still exceeds our confidence. More connected because the mysteries above Earth are not separate from us. They are made of our ambitions, our anxieties, our inventions, and our forgetting. So maybe the enduring wonder is not that unknown things circle our planet. It is that in trying to identify them, we keep uncovering a more complicated portrait of ourselves. Restless, brilliant, uncertain, and still learning how to recognize our own reflection in the dark. In the end, the story of strange objects above Earth is not really a story about strangers. It is a story about proximity, about how the space nearest our world, so close in cosmic terms, so distant in human feeling, became a place where knowledge, secrecy, memory, and imagination learned to orbit together. We looked upward, expecting either clarity or revelation. Instead, we found something more familiar and more difficult, a region shaped by human action, yet never fully contained by human explanation. One by one, many mysteries yielded to patience. The dark object became part of Cold War context. The second moon became the echo of Apollo. The impossible silhouette in orbit became a lost fragment from a mission carried out by fallible, brilliant people at work. Other objects resolved into forgotten programs, classified satellites, aging hardware, and debris that had simply outlasted the stories attached to them. The extraordinary, again and again, turned out to be woven from ordinary human forces: ambition, caution, error, invention, and time. But that does not make the journey smaller. It makes it more honest. Because what these objects truly revealed was not evidence of an alien presence, but the complexity of our own. They showed us that modern life produces mysteries of its own kind, not supernatural ones, but technological and historical ones. Mysteries born when we create faster than we remember, when we hide what we fear to disclose, when we leave behind artifacts that continue moving long after their meaning has faded from public view. And still, something beautiful remains in the act of looking up, not because we expect the sky to confirm our fantasies, but because it continues to test our humility. It asks us to observe carefully, to doubt responsibly, to imagine without surrendering reason. It reminds us that truth is often less theatrical than rumor, yet far more moving. Perhaps that is the lasting human lesson of all these silent travelers, that the future will always leave objects behind, and the task of wisdom is not merely to identify them, but to understand what they say about the civilization that set them in motion, and whether, when the time comes, we will still know how to read the traces of ourselves among the stars.